we're all different. Every human is a different entity, a different nervous system. We're all kind of, snowflakes, if you like. So, trying to design a system that kind of can deal with that level of individuality is really, really challenging unless you start to really think about what are the commonalities.
The concept of psychosocial risk is far from new, but the dialogue and industry discussion about the topic has elevated since regulatory changes were announced in 2023 and 2024. Psychosocial risk is now the focus of many conversations in the corporate world, from boardrooms to executive teams, and of course through to the practitioners on the ground, trying to join the dots to have meaningful impact. I'm Kate Connors. I'm a master's qualified psychologist, and my professional purpose is to help people and workplaces be at their best.
And I'm Greg Smith. I'm a lawyer who's spent more than 30 years practicing in the areas of employment law and workplace health and safety. I'm also the author of several books, including Paper Safe and the recently published Proving Safety.
And you are listening to Judgemental, when a psychologist and a lawyer walk into a barside chat about psychosocial risk. A big thanks to our sponsor, EML. EML are Australia's largest personal injury claims provider, providing claims management services to workers' compensation, life insurance and CTP markets, with the purpose of helping people get their lives back. We have another jam-packed episode today, so grab a drink and sit back for another discussion at the bar. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Judgemental. Welcome from myself, Kate Connors, and Greg, welcome to you. How are you today?
Good, thanks, Kate. Good, I'm well. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I would like to, as always, pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging.
As would I, and I am once again on the beautiful lands of the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects also. And I'm in an ebullient mood today, Mr. Smith. Ebullient. Do you like that word?
Would you say thesaurus?
You weren't expecting that, and I think you need to be around someone who's ebullient because you're having a bad day. So I'm going to spread fairy dust of ebullience all over you. So, and that is because I'm feeling ebullient because we have got Dr. Rod Gutierrez here with us today. Hello, Rod.
Hello there. How's it going? Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for joining us. And the reason I'm feeling so pumped and excited is because of your wonderful book that we are going to be discussing, because it is just such a great book. And so I thought it's got me pumped. It's got me pumped, Rod.
Excellent.
Is it possible to be pumped about psychosocial risk book?
Why not?
Apparently. Well, with that, we need to have the right drink for everybody's mood. So what can we get you, Rod? What do you feel like today?
I'm recovering from a bit of a cold, so I'm having good old water, but I put a slice of lemon because that just takes it to the next level.
No bubbles? No bubbles in there?
Good, yes, sparkling water. Is there any other kind?
Greg, what are you going to have today?
I have a gin and tonic. It's beautiful over here at the moment. Nice and sunny and warm. It's lovely autumn weather.
Well, it's very beautiful here too. And because of my ebullient mood, and the beautiful weather, I'm having champagne.
Oh, wow. Okay, you are in a good mood.
I know. Who'd have thought that? Who'd have thought that? Anyway, let's get into this conversation. Rod, I'd love to kick off, if you wouldn't mind sharing with listeners a bit about your very unique professional qualifications and skill set that you bring to the complexity of psychosocial risk. Like, can you just tell us a little bit about your quals and your health registrations and a bit about your career just to set the scene for everyone?
Yeah, so I started my professional life out as a psychologist and did that for about 10 years and worked in clinical psychology and in rehabilitation as well. So we used to run, was back then probably the first specialized psychological injury rehabilitation provider in New South Wales. This is in the late 90s. And after that, after working in clinical practice for a while, I realized that, people always was top two of psychological practice was relationships and work. And so that got me really interested in what is it about work that makes people unwell, that contribute to poor mental health. And I went off and did a PhD in what we were then calling the precipitating factors to psychological injury claim. And I remember going to my supervisor saying, "This is what I want to do," and she was saying, "Maybe we should do something a bit more marketable, something more relevant." And I remember thinking, "Okay, well, little did she know that 20, 25 years later, this was going to become, a hot topic." And so I did that, and eventually decided to kind of go into consulting, and looked at, which was the largest health and safety consultancy in the world at that time, and that was DuPont. And so I went to work for them, spent 10 years at DuPont before they became DSS, which was like a spin-off DuPont. I then spent 10 years outside of that organization chasing a dream of becoming a medical practitioner, which took me about 10 years too. And eventually I came back again into health and safety and occupational medicine in my work with BHP, where I was vice president of health and hygiene, and then at Rio Tinto, where I was deputy chief medical officer. So I have a kind of unusual background in that I fit into a very small Venn diagram of doctor and psychologist, and still have
Yeah.
frustration for both, and also have spent quite some time sort of really thinking about this topic, and which is why the net effect came about as a kind of a place to put a whole bunch of ideas that I had around this topic, and what kind of emerged, if you like.
Yeah. When you first told me that you'd written the book and you gave me a copy, and I was very grateful for you to do that. And on reading it, I can remember being maybe about 10 or 15 pages in. I had this recollection of when I was at university, and my one of my main professors there, she described to us the key textbook that we were going to be working to. And it was a book called Interpersonal Process and Psychotherapy, A Relational Approach. And it was written by this guy called Edward Tiber. And Jenny said, "This is the book that I wish I'd written." So she kind of proclaimed that to everybody. And when I started reading your book, I thought, oh my goodness, this is the book I wish I'd written. But I'm not smart enough to have written it. So I'm very, very glad that you did. Tell us a bit more about, you say that all of those qualifications and experience led to you wanting to write the book. What was your process? Like when you've got so much in your head that you think needs to be written down to shared with the world, how did you go about that?
The process was kind of continuous, I guess. So what I eventually did, pulling the work together, was kind of edit a whole number of papers that I had written over a period of time. So I write out my thinking into essays, and I argue with myself and things like that in writing. And then I was, in a particular context where I was, not allowed to write books unless there was an agreement from my employer. And so I'm not allowed to publish books, but I could write books. And so a lot of this book got written in sort of in the sidelines of life over a long time and over a long period. Ideas jotted together. I often write LinkedIn posts in long form, which eventually become pieces of a book. I'm a really big believer in recycling your work. So eventually you kind of end up with a collection of ideas that is basically telling a story, and then ultimately became about, well, what is the story of the book that I want to tell, and what is the strongest metaphor that I can use. And that's where that idea of we've been kind of going out to fish one hazard at a time, and then what we really need to do is throw the net out. And that's kind of it became that kind of the framing of the book. And then, I took the opportunity to talk to leaders about this, and to governance and boards and regulators. And so everyone kind of got a little bit, I think. And then I got really kind of idealistic, and I wrote a whole couple of chapters on what work could be, that whole idea of the vibrant organization, and how, the ancient Greeks have been talking and thinking about this for thousands of years. And, we're just kind of the latest people to kind of grapple with some very, very old concepts.
Well, does that feel familiar to you, Greg, when you listened to Rod's process about writing the book? I loved when the three of us caught up for a drink last year. I felt like a little fly on the wall watching these two big brains both chatting with each other about their writing process. But Greg, can you relate to what Greg's saying there in terms of how you construct and think about your book?
Yep. No, my process is the actual writing of the book is a reasonably short process. The coalescence of ideas through articles and notebooks and scribbled bits of paper is a long process. And then in some ways, for me, a lot of it is an exercise in anger management. When I've just had a complete gut full of what I see going around the place, I say, put it down in the book and throw that out there.
It's therapeutic.
Well, that's probably a good segue into the question that I wanted to ask both of you in terms of the management of frustration about the dominant paradigm, right, that is around the sector. And both of you in books are essentially throwing a mirror up in front of the dominant paradigms in workplace health and safety and in psychosocial risk and saying those paradigms. Greg, for you, it's that checklist gives the illusion of safety, paperwork gives the illusion of safety. Rod, yours is getting very specific into psychosocial risk. But I wanted to ask you both, Greg, I mean, I know that you probably weren't ready for this, but how do you think that translates into what that feels like for practitioners day to day when there is such a disconnect, I guess, in terms of some of the dominant paradigms that people think that they should be working to versus what your book and the essence of what you think doesn't seem to align?
I don't think you can easily generalize. I think there are a lot of people who, again, if we put it in a very specific psychosocial context, there would be a lot of people who just struggle with it full stop because it doesn't fit within what I would call their comfort zone of checklists and procedures and the normal sort of archetypes of safety management. So I think for some of them, it would be a struggle, not because they want to break out of the paradigm, but because it doesn't fit the paradigm. There'll be many for whom they find it problematic because they recognise that the archetypes of safety management don't really suit psychosocial risk management.
Yeah.
And they tend to be people who have, it's interesting. So, if you see people who come from things like teaching and nursing or a background predominantly in workers' compensation, they tend to be more concerned about the welfare of the individual people and less concerned about the process. So I don't think you can generalise, but I do think it is a struggle. And I do think the speed with which we went from the speed with which we went to psychosocial regulations and the knee-jerk reaction to that without recognising that this was just building on what had come before has kind of exacerbated that problem a bit.
What do you think, Rod? What are you noticing about the sense of the gap between the paradigms, the dominant paradigms, and what is effective in this space and how practitioners on the ground are trying to make sense of that and to maintain meaning in their work?
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say in that effect is that we ultimately must rise above our paradigms, that the paradigms hold. And having said that, doesn't mean we don't comply, but best practice and regulatory compliance often don't live in the same page, right? So, and this is just the beginning. I keep saying to people that there has been, an onus on employers to look after the health and safety of people since the enactment of the Workforce and Safety Act, right? So none of this is new. What is new is the emphasis, and what is new is the onus that is being put back onto employers to very, very specifically deal with the issues. But ultimately, what we're also asking people to do is to use, 70-year-old linear machine engineering frameworks to be applied to solve 21st century complex human problems. And once you can do that, and how you might sort of arrange your documentation and your program of works to be compliant with that, that's fine. We can do that, but it has to go over and above that. So I think it's about understanding the paradigm that we're in, knowing that it will shift because it has to, and this has to continue to evolve, and then be in the best possible place to have a meaningful intervention as opposed to just a tick a box, I've done a risk assessment, right? And that's where I'm kind of at the moment. What does a good control look like, and how do we assess it, and how do we measure it, and how do we evaluate it? And that's a much harder nut to crack. Everyone's been stuck in this idea of assessing against risk. And, in essence, we got given the risks. We got 17 risks in the code of practice. We know they're there and they're ubiquitous, and actually that they share a lot of the variants. And so we need to do now is think about, okay, well, how do we put some meaningful controls around some of these things? And knowing that if you control for one thing, you're probably controlling for something else. And so the idea of the convergence, idea of the net becomes really, really important.
There's an interesting side bit to that as well. This is where I think that there's a couple of things. I'll be brief if I can. I don't think in the book dichotomy between the physical and the psychological that you describe is as far removed as it might create the impression, because there's a line in there that physical harm can't be managed by checklists and hazard tags. And I think if you look through like the new view of safety, I think they've very strongly come to that view that lots of physical harm can't be managed like that either. And a lot of the cultural aspects you draw out in the book really well, much better than a lot of the commentators on new view safety do, I think is something that hopefully the physical side of safety to say that will take on board. But to your point about, and I think this is another big challenge, in the way you've created the metaphor of the net, the trying to, controlling for one thing, controls for another. But we also have the other trade-off that we see in wicked problems, that controlling for one thing can create hazards in another area. And I think there's enough evidence around that suggests, where we control for physical hazard with the traditional mechanistic command and control structures, we actually contribute to psychosocial problems in the workplace. So part of the management, I think, of psychosocial risk will be kind of letting go of some of the command and control that's hard baked into the management of physical harm.
Yeah, I probably agree with that.
That's really interesting, Greg. And just to make sure we don't lose this thread, we're going to be doing an interview, listeners, just kind of forecasting. We're really fortunate to have secured a couple of guests, one who's the head of workplace health and safety and their HSR is going to be joining us for a conversation in a couple of weeks. And the case study they're going to talk through is exactly that, Greg. It's about how they brought WorkSafe in because they were worried about a physical safety risk, and actually through a really meaningful process of consultation around a broader range of risks, all of the risks, physical and psychosocial, have been better managed. So to me, it really lands on the point that you were making just there about how these things are going to intersect even more and more. Rod, Greg and I have talked a lot about the challenges around individual difference in management of psychosocial risk. And I think your metaphor about the net effect really speaks to that beautifully. Do you want to share with listeners a little bit more about that metaphor, just so they can really understand the difference between a hazard by hazard approach and this net effect approach that you're describing?
So I guess in a nutshell, the analogy is that our traditional models of risk management, if you like, go line by line, looking hazard by hazard, and then create a causal effect line between this hazard and the potential outcome, and then calculate a risk of that happening by applying relation of how much likelihood there is of that happening versus the impact of that happening. And so we arrive at these quasi-mathematical calculations of risk, and we try to apply sort of, robustness of positivist science into what is fundamentally a social science. Risk management people don't like me saying this, but ultimately risk management is a social science, and we're dealing with the softer sides of things. We're dealing with humans, and so it's imperfect by definition. And we try to categorize things to a certain degree of certainty that often misleads us into thinking that we've managed something, when in fact we've just kind of made some parameters and some assumptions that makes us comfortable with a possible outcome. And so usually we take one hazard and we go fishing. I say, we throw a line into the lake, and we fish for that one hazard that comes up. We put that fish in a fishing bowl, and we kind of make it safe, and we kind of figure out what would the control be for this hazard, and we then build a matrix saying this is how we've dealt with the hazard. The individual differences process that we talk about in the net effect is that the hazard it goes through a lens through which is the individual's perception, life, history, mental resources, right? And so ultimately whether that has a harmful effect on an individual would very much depend on how they interpret, how they assess, how they deal with, and in the olden days we used to say cope with that particular challenge or hazard. And what we tend to find is, if you look at these hazards, as I did in some research in the early 2000s, I found that a lot of these psychological predisposing factors, if you like, shared a whole heap of variants. So you couldn't quite pull them apart. So, poor management capability and poor social control and social support actually are almost indeterminable in terms of where one starts and the other one begins. And so it makes less sense to go looking hazard by hazards when these hazards share so much variance. What makes more sense is to say, instead of throwing in a line and try and get these hazards out one by one, why don't we throw in a big net and see what hazards come out? And also, when you see that the hazards come out, you can actually start seeing the interconnectivity between the hazards. And you can start building more robust controls because you are dealing with multiple hazards at a time that have perhaps a similar or a same underlying basis, right? And so that's how this idea of consolidating the 16, 17 hazards into 5 hazard domains came about, which are all they were arrived by analyzing the data, figure out which hazards had the most shared variance and kind of went together in a statistical sense. And then it made sense to kind of say, well, for these, let's call them human interpersonal conflict hazards, for example, then it makes sense to have a range of controls that really try to address those interpersonal hazards in the workplace, as opposed to going, this is one hazard, this is one control, this is one hazard, this is one control, which can get very complex very quickly, particularly in a large organization. But more importantly, it can get very unwieldy for the people trying to manage the risk in an organization, say a supervisor or, a leader within a function. So it kind of became about chunking down some of the complexity, but then not losing the fact that this is a process that is ultimately derived through an individual lens, and that is the lens of individual difference. We're all different. Every human is a different entity, a different nervous system. We're all kind of, snowflakes, if you like. So, trying to design a system that kind of can deal with that level of individuality is really, really challenging unless you start to really think about what are the commonalities. And in many ways, that's the kind of the thrust of the book, is in how do we kind of make this a little bit simpler without losing and in fact anchoring ourselves in the fact that we're all different.
Greg, where's your brain? Where do you want to take the conversation?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think when most organisations hear anything has to be dealt with on an individual basis, it terrifies them, and they think, there will be people who hear this and say, okay, that means I need to do an individual risk assessment of every individual in my organisation, because they'll apply the same way of thinking. They'll just apply it onto people. And I think I'm going to use some out of context terms. I'm going to go back to sort of Suffolk, the sort of stuff that Suffolk and Week talk about. And that's linking two concepts. One is this idea of sensitivity to operations, but personalizing it. So being sensitive to changes in your people, Kate, which you always talk about as being the warning sign. Because when courts talk about these things, because they recognize very clearly that different people respond to different things in different ways, and the onus kind of shifts to the employer or the PCBU, however you want to phrase it, on the question of foreseeability. And so if we are sensitive to operations or sensitive to our people through a psychosocial lens to say somebody's behavior in the workplace is changing, that then puts us on notice that there is a foreseeable risk that they might be prone to or suffering from some sort of psychosocial harm. So I'm not particularly scared of the idea of individualizing this stuff, and I don't think you can avoid doing it. I just think it's how do we make sure and that the mechanisms that we have in place around these kind of risk factors help people to be attuned to changes, individuals or the workplace or responses or whatever it might be, and then equip people to be able to either escalate or deal with it.
It's such an interesting and topical point that you're making, and I'm somewhat reluctant to bring a sporting case study into this, but at the moment, what happened with Carlton and the footballer who the language that's being used in the football media has had a mental health episode, and Carlton Football Club being fined in regards to their lack of immediate response or lack of response to that, in the sense that the finding was that the player was left out on the field for too long. When I saw that, I went to our conversations about this, Greg, in terms of, it was ages ago. It was certainly, I think, in our first series that I made the comment that now it is expected that organisations train people in understanding signs and symptoms of possible mental or psychological harm, or that something is different in an individual. It becomes an expected practice. It does become a sense of, well, actually, you knew that there was something not right with this person. Something was going on. You have a duty of care to explore what that is. Don't assume what it is, but you've got a duty of care to explore what it is. And to me, this is so important because it speaks to the integrated approach to proper care and to workplace mental health strategy, Rog. Like, there is so much focus at the moment on prevention, and rightly so. And, I'm not going to argue with that, but my fear is that the mitigate pillar of workplace mental health and that support pillar around what do we do to quickly intervene as best as we can when we notice that someone might be at risk of harm, and that might be to do with our workplace, we need to ask that there doesn't seem to be the right amount of focus. Well, I'm not hearing the same amount of conversation about that we used to. I don't know, Rod, what your kind of reference or reflection on that is. And Greg, I can see you have something to say as well.
No, Rod, go first.
Look, I feel like I often look at organizations' sort of controls and mitigating controls. And the first thing you see there is EAP, right? So it's kind of like seems to be a reflex reaction. But I'm going to be a little bit controversial here. EAP to me has always been the outsourcing of care to someone else, right? And I think we need to become real in that this needs to be one of the avenues available, absolutely. But ultimately, the first line of that has to be the supervisor, has to be the leader. And if you go to your leader and the first thing that leader says to you is, here is a 1-300 number, call them because they'll care for you. That's a message that we are sending constantly. If you got a problem, you got an issue, mental health, you're not feeling great, here's a phone number. I think we owe it to our people to show up for them when they need us and to hold them in a safe space when they require that. The issue is, it's not business as usual. So how do I do that? And a lot of people are quite not scared, but concerned that they might say something wrong or that they might make it worse, right? And I think there's a good deal to be done around just creating the expectations of what good mental health support looks like at work, and what can we expect of each other, and what do we owe each other in times of when things are not going so well, and when I need some flexibility, when I need even a friendly ear to listen to whatever might be going on. We seem a bit put off by the conversation, a bit scared of the conversation. And even though we have, every year we have all of the rigmarole around, our suicide prevention programs, etc., we still haven't made the inroads that we need to be making in terms of making these conversations real and accessible at a level.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I'm deeply concerned. We know in most workplaces across Australia, it is difficult enough to get workers to intervene or respond to a physical hazard, an objectively physical hazard. When they see someone physically working unsafely, there's an enormous reluctance still for somebody to speak up and say, hey, John or Bluey, I'm not quite sure you should be doing it that way. And that predominates in high-risk activities like construction and mining, as far as I can tell. So what is a realistic expectation to have people intervene and respond in circumstances of psychosocial harm, which still carries this enormous taboo and fear? And you're right, people are terrified of getting it wrong. I mean, they're being told that they'll be blamed if they get it wrong. But the bigger concern, of course, is like so many initiatives in health and safety, and I know we shouldn't be talking to it about this, it's a much bigger question, but that's not how I think it's currently being, in the vast majority of cases, that's not how it's being pursued, is it all lands on the poor old bloody supervisor to pick up the burden of all of this stuff. And it's like, it's the CEO and the supervisor, and it's like there's no one else exists in the organisation to deal with all of this.
Yeah. I would love to think that with so much effort, energy, and exuberance going into how AI is going to transform workplaces, that maybe the same degree of exuberance and focus would potentially, maybe ever, go into the capacity for us to actually try and make some inroads in how humans deal with humans, let alone try and make inroads about how humans are going to deal with AI. Like, I find this conversation so frustrating, and like, I don't disagree with you, Greg, and I absolutely agree with Rod. Like, I know, but the reality of what goes on in human to human interactions, we can't even do this very well with our kids and our partners and our, brothers and sisters and friends when we're noticing that people are being spiky or difficult or grumpy or all the time, and eventually people just get the shits. And like it is the truth that humans dealing with other humans, that we can fall short in how we interact with each other. So what is the system around that? What is the system around the reality that humans can often not be great with each other is the essence of what we're talking about here, I think. Rod, what do you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've had a few interviews in the last few weeks about the issue of AI and risk management and, are the machines coming to replace us and all of this sort of stuff. The premise of AI is, if we use AI for good and not for evil, then there's a lot of good that can be done, right? But there's also, there's two avenues here. There's one where AI comes to enhance what we do and bolster us and support us. And there's the other side of this, which is where AI comes to replace us. And unfortunately, we've seen now, wholesale replacement of people in the workplace happening even live, even in Australia, right? So people have developed I think a mistrust of AI, and it then intersects with psychosocial in ways that weren't apparent when I wrote this book, where now there's a whole area of employment uncertainty and redundancies that are occurring because whole departments have been made unnecessary because of the work that AI can do. The idea of the data analysis aspect of this, or the idea in which, the bottom pyramid of a lot of consulting organizations can be taken on by AI. And so it starts having a displacement kind of impact, which is creating now a real kind of hazard in itself of role ambiguity, in unstable employment, casualization of the workforce. And then, you're also then now going to have an agent working in your team. What does that mean? How do you, like you said, we haven't figured out how to work with the humans yet, let alone now we have AI agents working among us, and who manages them? How do we manage the workload? How do we figure it out? No one has lived through this. And so it's been left up to the HR professionals and the safety management professionals and in organizations to kind of make best attempts to figure it out. And it's both alarming and challenging, but also fascinating to watch, right?
Well, it is an opportunity really to try to integrate the challenge of, to the point that you were making, Greg, and that I'm always on my soapbox about, that everything always lands with the leaders, etc. And there's no safe system for leaders to make sure that their work design and the system that they work in is enabling them to be who we need them to be. But if an organisation was to see this as an opportunity to really consult with leaders, how could AI help you so that you can get out of the weeds of some things and really lean into the human element that we need you to do? That would be extraordinary, right? Like, that would just be such a wonderful outcome. I look forward to hopefully interviewing some organisation that takes that approach and that we can share it with listeners. Greg, where was your brain going?
It'll be interesting. I do think AI represents some level of opportunity from the things that I'm deeply concerned about. And certainly from a supervisor's perspective, it will probably create potential to get them out from behind desks and Excel spreadsheets and contribution of paperwork to do more time on the ground. But I've been arguing that for a couple of decades now, saying, I remember very early on I started this and people would say, what's the one thing you'd do to improve safety? So if I had $80,000, I'd get an admin assistant for all the supervisors so they could go and be supervisors. That, you can tell how long ago that was. I don't think you get an assistant now for $80,000. But anyway, by the by. But this will be where priority sits, because if we can suddenly free up our supervisors to do more supervision, is psychosocial risk really going to be on the list of priorities? I mean, I don't even know if physical harm will be on the list of priorities any more than it is now, and whether it's still operational production drivers. That they're the real challenges. And I'd like to make this book. The book I'm really enjoying. I'm not quite finished it. I'm really enjoying it, but very strong focus on culture. But my fear in all of these conversations is you take something like culture, and unfortunately the health and safety industry thinks it has a view about, knows what culture is, and I don't think it does. And all they've done is repurpose culture to I think, to be an excuse to not do the work necessary to actually manage their organizations. So we're going to bring someone in, we're going to run a culture program, we'll stick some posters up on the wall. My job's done. I don't need to engage with the workforce. I don't need to have a good assurance program because we've got culture now. And that's the one thing that I'm really concerned about in all of this, is the way that things simply get repurposed as programs in organizations, in the way that safety leadership and frontline supervision programs get repurposed as a one and done, away we go. Leadership programs get repurposed. If it's not organic from the organisation, I don't think it takes it very far.
Yeah. Look, I think it goes back to the fact that when you read any major incident investigation, the last concluding paragraph will always say something along the lines of, this was a failure of a culture of compliance, or a culture of where these things were allowed to happen, right? And so culture has become the ultimate test of whether or not things like this can happen. And I think we thought, and I agree, a lot of these programs think that culture is an input. Like, you can change it over here. But in fact, culture is an output, and it's the last thing you make. And if you look at it like that, and then you think about what are all the inputs that will actually impact culture, and try and have a program that takes it from that point of view, then I think you kind of get over that
Yep.
sort of, let's call it hype, marketing and consulting hype. And I think there is a lot of that, fortunately. Yeah. The other thing is, we need to think about, if you want to change culture, then probably psychology and sociology even are not where culture lives. Culture lives in anthropology, right? And so we often come to this with the hats that don't correspond to the science or the paradigm that we're trying to shift. And one of the things that I've done a lot, if I've spent a lot of time studying about anthropology and the study of culture of its own, and how cultures develop. And I think when you start doing that, you shift the paradigm, and therefore you shift what you do so that you can get to that different outcome. And I think we've got a lot to learn in that space.
Yep. That's, fascinating. So this book by a guy called Dr. Nipan Anand, he's an anthropologist, done a lot of work in the Costa Concordia accident where the captain was sent to prison. He's been and interviewed the captain of the vessel in prison. He does fascinating work. And I think, so if you talk to people like Nipan or Dr. Rob Long and a few others about
Yes.
the need for a multidisciplinary approach to safety, drawing from psychology and anthropology and the law and engineering, sociology, it has to be a broad church, I think, which,
Absolutely. Has to be multimodal and multi-paradigm to solve the problem, which is multifactorial and so complex.
Well, I think, gentlemen, that this is probably not a bad place for us to bring a little pause to part one of our conversation. Listeners, we're going to have part two of a conversation with Rod in regards to looking at the bit more of a deep dive into some of the two particular frameworks that he puts forward in the book, one in regards to controls and the other in regards to grouping hazards, which he spoke about. But we want to do justice to those conversations, and we didn't think that we could do justice to some of the broader things that we've spoken about today, as well as a deep dive into those things in, the trusty 45 minutes that we like to stick to make sure Greg doesn't say, right, it's time. So based on that, any kind of key takeaways just from the conversation that we've had today, Rod, before we put a pause and then regroup again for another chat?
Not from me. I think it's been really great to chat to you guys, like-minded, not different backgrounds, but trying to grapple with similar issues. I think there's not enough of this kind of thing happening. And that's where that cross-pollination, cross-collaboration, broader solutioning will come from. So thank you very much for having me.
Greg, what about you? Key reflections from the part one of our chat with Rod? Key takeaways?
My key reflection more from the reading was that, what Rod's describing in the book is, I think, what a lot of the new view safety is grappling with without really understanding what it's grappling with. But I do want to foreshadow that for the next session, I will be putting squarely on the table what this conversation means about how we should be thinking about regulatory frameworks of safety and whether our current 1970-based models are actually fit for purpose.
I agree. And I think that that's the right place for us to be having that deeper, more quite animated, I would imagine, conversation. For me, in terms of key takeouts, I think the idea of a net is I think quite groundbreaking as people do begin to shift from that linear model. So for me, one of the key takeouts is, and Greg talks about it more than what I do, but the oversimplification and the engineering and linear paradigm that is being imposed on psychosocial risk. And the more that we can encourage people to be brave and to step away from that type of not fit for purpose paradigm, the more meaning and impact and purpose people will experience from their work in psychosocial safety. So that, I think, is my key takeout for people and for listeners at this point. And so I just wanted to say thank you, gents, for part one of our conversation. And I look forward to our next step of the grouping of hazards as a simpler and probably more meaningful way of approaching controls of hazards, and therefore also a different approach to thinking through how you can design and have intention about your control system as well. So join us for part 2, listeners, and we will see you then at the bar. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Rod.
Bye.
That's a wrap for another episode of Judgemental. Thanks again to our sponsors, EML. EML's Mutual Benefits Program provides organisations with free services, tools and resources to manage their workplace risk. You can follow EML, myself and Greg on LinkedIn, and be sure to check the show notes for links to the papers referenced in each episode, as well as resources available to help you as you navigate the wonderfully complex and nuanced world of psychosocial risk. See you again next time at the bar.